James Harrison stood at the window of his expensive office, looking down at the busy streets of London. He wore a perfect suit and had everything money could buy. His father, William Harrison, owned Harrison Construction Company, one of Britain's biggest building companies. But James felt empty inside, like something important was missing from his life. At 28 years old. James had a business degree from a top university and worked in a corner office with a beautiful view. He made important decisions about construction projects and signed papers that affected thousands of workers. But he had never held a hammer in his hands. He had never mixed concrete or laid a single brick. He knew nothing about the real work that his father's company did. Every day, James watched construction workers from his office window. They looked so small from up there, like tiny ants moving round the building sites. He made decisions about their lives, their pay, and their working conditions, but he had never spoken to any of them. He wondered what their lives were really like. One evening, James went to his father's grand house for dinner. They sat in the expensive dining room, eating food prepared by a cook and served by helpers. James felt nervous, but he had made up his mind to ask his father something important. "Dad, I want to work on a real construction site," James said, putting down his fork. "Not as your son, but as a regular worker. I need to understand what our employees really go through every day." William Harrison nearly choked on his wine. He was a big man with grey hair and serious eyes. He had built his company from nothing and was very proud of what he had achieved. "That's ridiculous, James," he said with a frown. "You belong in the boardroom, not on a building site. You have an education. You have a future in management. But I don't understand the work, Dad. How can I make good decisions about people's lives if I don't know what they do? You understand business. That's what matters." James leaned forward. "Please, Dad, just for a few months, I'll use a different name. Nobody will know who I am. I want to learn what it's really like to work with my hands." They argued for an hour. William thought his son was being foolish, but James was determined. He had always felt guilty about his comfortable life while other people worked so hard. Finally, William agreed, but only if the site manager knew James's real identity in case something went wrong. The next Monday morning, James woke up at 5 o'clock. He had never gotten up so early in his life. He put on old clothes he had bought from a charity shop and made a simple lunch to put in a metal box. He looked at himself in the mirror and hardly recognized the person staring back at him. James drove to the company's newest project in Manchester. It was a big apartment building that would house hundreds of families. He parked his expensive car far away and walked to the site entrance. His hands were shaking as he approached the other workers. "Good morning," he said to a group of men drinking tea. "I'm Jim Thompson. I'm starting work here today." The work was harder than James had ever imagined. His soft hands got blisters within the first hour. His back ached from lifting heavy materials. His legs hurt from standing all day. He struggled to keep up with the experienced workers who moved quickly and knew exactly what to do. But something wonderful happened that James had never expected. For the first time in his life, people liked him for who he was, not because of his family's money or his father's power. Nobody knew he was rich. Nobody treated him differently. He was just another worker trying to do his job. He met Tom, a kind man with calloused hands and a warm smile. Tom had 2 young children and worked extra hours whenever he could to buy his daughter a new school uniform. He was always tired, but he never complained. He shared his tea with James and patiently taught him how to use the tools properly. There was also Lucy, a strong woman who had to prove herself every day in a workplace full of men. Some of the workers didn't think women belonged on construction sites. But Lucy worked twice as hard as anyone else. She showed James how to read the building plans and always had time to help when he made mistakes. Then there was David, an older man with grey hair who had been building houses for 30 years. He took pride in every brick he laid and every wall he built. He told James stories about the beautiful buildings he had created and the families who lived in them. These people welcomed James with open arms. They included him in their conversations, laughed at his jokes, and helped him learn. James felt a warmth he had never experienced in his father's cold corporate world. For the first time in his life, he felt like he truly belonged somewhere. 3 weeks had passed since James started working as Jim Thompson on the construction site. His body was changing in ways he had never expected. His soft office hands now had thick calluses and small scars from handling rough materials. His arms were stronger from lifting heavy blocks and carrying tools. His back no longer ached every morning. But the biggest change was in his heart, which had grown softer and more understanding. James learned things about his new friends that made him see the world differently. Tom, the kind man who had taught him to use tools, often worked through his lunch break. At first, James thought Tom was just very dedicated to his job. But one day, James noticed that Tom would sit quietly while everyone else ate their sandwiches. "Aren't you hungry, Tom?" James asked. Tom smiled sadly. "I'm saving money for my daughter's school trip. She wants to go to the seaside with her class. But it costs £30. If I skip lunch a few times, I can give her that money." James felt his heart break a little in his old life. £30 was nothing. He would spend more than that on coffee in a week. But for Tom, it meant not eating lunch for days. Lucy faced different challenges. She worked twice as hard as any man on the site. But some people still didn't take her seriously. James watched her lift heavy materials that some men struggled with. She knew more about construction than most of the other workers, but she had to prove herself every single day. "I dream of becoming a site supervisor," Lucy told James one afternoon as they took a break. "I've been working construction for ages, but they always give those jobs to men. They say women aren't tough enough to lead a construction team." James saw the determination in her eyes. He knew Lucy was smarter and worked harder than many of the supervisors he had met in his father's company. It wasn't fair that she had to fight so hard for respect. David had his own struggles. The old man had been building houses for 30 years. He knew every trick, every shortcut, and every way to make a building strong and beautiful. But he had been passed over for promotion many times. Younger men with less experience were given better jobs, while David remained a regular worker. "I don't mind the work," David told James one evening. "I love building things, but it would be nice to be recognized for what I know. I've trained dozens of young men over the years, and many of them are supervisors now. But I'm still here, doing the same job I did 20 years ago, despite their struggles." James looked forward to joining his friends every morning. The work was hard, but it started with jokes and laughter. Tom would tell funny stories about his children. His little daughter had lost her first tooth and left it under her pillow for the tooth fairy. His son was learning to ride a bicycle and kept falling off. But he never gave up trying. Lucy would share her dreams and plans. She wanted to start her own construction company someday, one where women would be treated equally. She had already designed plans for several buildings in her spare time. James was amazed by her talent and creativity. David was like a teacher to all of them. He would show them the proper way to mix concrete so it would be strong for 100 years. He taught them how to lay bricks so they would never crack or fall down. He explained why certain materials were better than others and how to build things that would last forever. James began to see construction work as an art form. These weren't just workers like he had always thought. They were craftsmen, artists, and engineers. They took pride in creating something beautiful and lasting with their hands. When a section of the building was finished, they would all stand back and admire their work. They knew they had made something good for the world, something that would house families and create homes. In his old life, James had made decisions from behind a desk in a comfortable office. He would look at numbers on paper and make choices that affected thousands of people. But he never saw the faces of those people or understood how his decisions changed their lives. Now, he understood that every choice affected real people with real dreams and real struggles. When Tom's daughter got sick with a fever, James saw how worried his friend was about taking time off work. Tom was afraid he might lose pay or even his job if he stayed home to care for his child. James had never worried about such things in his privileged life. When Lucy was treated unfairly by a rude supervisor who shouted at her for no reason, James felt anger he had never experienced before. He wanted to defend his friend, but he knew it might make things worse for her. The other workers began to trust James completely. They told him their hopes and fears, their worries about job security, and their dreams for their families. James realized that these people were not just employees on his father's payroll. They were the heart and soul of Harrison Construction Company. The rain was falling hard on the construction site that Tuesday morning, making everything slippery and dangerous. James arrived at work feeling happy, as he always did now. He enjoyed spending time with his friends and learning new skills every day. But what he discovered that morning would change everything. As James walked toward the equipment shed, he noticed something that made his stomach feel sick. The safety equipment that all the workers had to use was old and broken. The hard hats had cracks in them. The safety ropes were frayed and worn. Some of the harnesses had broken buckles that had been held together with tape. James picked up one of the safety harnesses and examined it closely. The straps were so old they felt like they might break at any moment. This was the equipment that was supposed to keep workers safe if they fell from high places. James felt his heart racing as he realized how dangerous this was. "Why don't we have new safety equipment?" James asked Robert, the site manager, who was standing nearby. Robert looked round to make sure no one else was listening. "The company says new equipment is too expensive right now. They want us to use what we have until it completely falls apart. They're trying to save money." James couldn't believe what he was hearing. His father's company had millions of pounds, but they wouldn't spend money to keep workers safe. He watched in horror as Tom began climbing a tall ladder, wearing the broken safety harness that James had just examined. "Tom, wait." James called out. "That harness doesn't look safe." Tom looked down and shrugged. "I know, Jim, but it's all we have. If we don't use it, we can't work. And if we can't work, we don't get paid." James felt helpless as he watched his friend climb higher and higher with equipment that could fail at any moment. The rain made everything more slippery, but Tom had no choice. He needed the money to feed his family. Later that day, James saw Lucy working with electrical equipment that was clearly faulty. Sparks were flying from the wires, and the tools were making strange buzzing sounds. This was extremely dangerous. But Lucy continued working because she had been told the new equipment was too expensive. "Lucy, that doesn't look safe," James said, walking over to her. "I know," Lucy replied. not looking up from her work. "But what choice do I have? If I complain, they might fire me. There are plenty of other people who would take my job." During their lunch break, James sat with David under a small shelter, trying to stay dry. The old man looked tired and worried. His hands were shaking slightly as he drank his tea. "David, are you feeling all right?" James asked. David looked round to make sure no one was listening, then leaned closer to James. "Can I tell you something, Jim? But you have to promise not to tell anyone else." "Of course," James said. "3 workers have been hurt badly in the past month," David whispered. "One man fell because his safety rope broke. Another got electrocuted by faulty equipment. A woman cut her hand on a broken tool that should have been replaced months ago." James felt his blood run cold. Did they report these accidents? David shook his head sadly. They were all too scared to report it officially. They were afraid they might lose their jobs if they complained. The company would rather pretend these accidents never happened than spend money to fix the problems. "That's terrible," James said, feeling anger building up inside him. "The big bosses don't care about us," David continued, his voice full of sadness. "They sit in their fancy offices and make decisions about our lives. But they've never done a day's work like this. They see us as numbers on a page, not as real people with families and dreams." James felt like he had been punched in the stomach. David was talking about people like him and his father. They were the big bosses who made these decisions. James realized that he had been one of those people who saw workers as numbers instead of human beings. That afternoon, things got even worse. James was walking past the site office when he heard Robert talking loudly on the phone. The door was slightly open, and James could hear every word clearly. "Yes, I understand," Robert was saying. 20 workers need to be laid off by the end of the month. The shareholders want to see higher profits this quarter, so we need to reduce costs." James pressed himself against the wall and listened in horror as Robert read out a list of names. Tom was on the list. Lucy was on the list. David was on the list. These good people who had welcomed James with kindness and friendship were going to lose their jobs so that wealthy shareholders could make more money. James felt sick to his stomach. His father's company was treating these wonderful people unfairly, and he was part of that system. He wanted to speak up and defend his friends, but he couldn't reveal who he really was without betraying their trust. That night, James lay in his bed unable to sleep. He thought about Tom's children and how they would suffer if their father lost his job. He thought about Lucy's dreams of becoming a supervisor and how those dreams would be crushed. He thought about David's 30 years of faithful service and how the company was repaying him with unemployment. James realized that his comfortable life had been built on the struggles of people like his new friends. The weight of this knowledge felt heavier than any construction materials he had ever carried. The next morning felt different from all the others. James arrived at the construction site with a heavy heart, knowing what was about to happen. The rain had stopped, but dark clouds still covered the sky, matching his mood. He had barely slept the night before, thinking about his friends who were about to lose their jobs. At exactly 9 o'clock, Robert called for everyone to gather round. This was unusual because the workers normally started their day immediately. James stood with Tom, Lucy, and David, trying to look calm even though his heart was pounding like a hammer against his chest. Robert stood on a small wooden box so everyone could see him. He had a serious expression on his face and held a piece of paper in his hands. The workers gathered in a circle round him, their faces showing confusion and worry. "I have an important announcement from the main office," Robert began. his voice cold and businesslike. "Due to budget constraints, we need to reduce our workforce. 20 people will be let go at the end of the week." The words hit the workers like a physical blow. James watched their faces change from confusion to shock to fear. These were people with families, rent to pay, and children to feed. 20 of them would lose their jobs in just a few days. James saw Tom's face turn completely white. Tom's hands started shaking as he thought about his two young children and how he would tell them that Daddy might not be able to buy food or pay for their school things. Lucy's strong hands, which James had seen lift heavy materials without, trembling, now shook like leaves in the wind. David's shoulders slumped forward as if he was carrying an invisible weight too heavy to bear. The other workers began whispering to each other, their voices filled with panic and worry. Some of them had been working for Harrison Construction for many years. They had given their best efforts to the company, and now they were being thrown away like broken tools. James felt anger building up inside him like steam in a kettle. He had watched these people work with dedication and pride. He had seen them help each other, share their lunch, and treat him with kindness even though he was new and inexperienced. They deserved so much better than this. "This is wrong," James suddenly shouted, stepping forward from the group. His voice was louder than he had intended, and everyone turned to look at him. "These people work harder than anyone I've ever met. They deserve better safety equipment, fair treatment, and job security. This company makes millions of pounds, but we can't afford to treat our workers with dignity." The other workers stared at James with surprise. They had never heard him speak so passionately before. In the past weeks, Jim Thompson had been quiet and humble, always listening and learning. Now, he sounded like a completely different person. Robert looked annoyed by James's outburst. "You don't understand how business works, Jim," he said dismissively, waving his hand as if James was just a foolish child. "These decisions are made by people who know about money and profits. Workers like you can't understand the bigger picture." "I understand more than you think," James replied, his voice shaking with emotion but growing stronger with each word. "I understand that profit means nothing if it comes at the cost of human suffering. I understand that a company is only as strong as the people who build it, literally and figuratively." James looked round at his friends and co-workers. "These people don't just work for this company. They are this company. Without them, there would be no buildings, no profits, no success. But they're treated like they don't matter, like they're just numbers on a piece of paper." Tom stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied James's face. "Jim, where did you learn to talk like that? You sound like you know more about this company than you're telling us. Normal workers don't speak about business the way you just did." Lucy nodded in agreement. "You're right, Tom. Jim, you've been different from the start. You pick up things too quickly. You ask questions that show you understand business better than most workers would." David, despite his sadness about losing his job, was also watching James carefully. "And you never talk about your past to your family. We've all shared our stories with you, but you've never really told us about yourself." James felt his heart racing even faster. His friends were smart, and they had noticed things about him that he thought he had hidden well. He looked at their faces. These good people who had trusted him, included him in their group, and cared for him like a brother. He knew he had reached a moment where he had to choose between continuing his lie or telling the truth. The truth would hurt them and might destroy their friendship forever, but lying to them felt even worse now that he cared about them so much. James took a deep breath and looked directly at Tom, Lucy, and David. His voice was quiet but clear when he spoke. "My name isn't Jim Thompson," he said, feeling like each word was cutting his heart. "It's James Harrison. William Harrison is my father. I am the son of the man who owns this company." The silence that followed was so complete that James could hear his own heartbeat. The truth was finally out. The silence that followed James's confession was so complete that it felt like the whole world had stopped breathing. Tom, Lucy, and David stared at him with wide eyes, their faces showing a mixture of shock, hurt, and deep anger. The other workers who had gathered round also looked stunned, as if they couldn't believe what they had just heard. Lucy was the first to speak, and her voice was shaking with emotion. "You've been lying to us this whole time," she said, her strong voice breaking like glass. "We trusted you completely. We told you our secrets, our fears, our dreams about our families. And you were just studying us like we were animals in a zoo." Tom's face had gone from pale to red with anger. His kind eyes, which had always looked at James with friendship, now showed deep pain. "Were we just some kind of experiment to you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did you laugh about us when you went home to your big house? Did you think we were stupid?" James felt tears starting to form in his eyes. His heart was breaking as he saw how much he had hurt these people who had become so important to him. At first, maybe, he admitted honestly, because he knew he couldn't lie anymore. But not anymore. "You've become my real friends, the best friends I've ever had. Everything I felt, everything I shared with you, that was real." David, the wise old man who had taught James so much, slowly shook his head. "How can we believe anything you say now?" he asked sadly. "You lied about your name, your background, your whole life. If you could lie about all of that, how do we know you're not lying about caring about us?" The other workers began to walk away, shaking their heads and muttering angry words. They felt betrayed and foolish. They had welcomed the rich boss's son into their group, shared their food with him, and told him their private thoughts. Now they felt like they had been tricked. James watched his friends turn away from him, and he felt more alone than he had ever felt in his life. But he couldn't give up. These people meant too much to him now. "Watch what I do, not what I say," he told them, his voice strong despite his tears. Over the next few weeks, James worked harder than he had ever worked in his life. But this time, he wasn't just working with his hands. He was working to change the entire company. He spent hours in meetings with his father, arguing and pleading for better treatment of the workers. James convinced his father to buy brand new safety equipment immediately. He showed William the broken harnesses and faulty tools, explaining how dangerous they were. "Dad, if someone gets badly hurt because we were too cheap to buy proper equipment, we'll lose much more than money," James argued. He fought to save all 20 jobs that were going to be cut. James presented his father with detailed plans showing how keeping the workers would actually help the company in the long run. It took many arguments and sleepless nights, but finally William agreed to cancel the layoffs. James also established a new system where workers could give feedback about their working conditions with fear of losing their jobs. He created opportunities for advancement within the company, so experienced workers like David could finally get the recognition they deserved. Most importantly, James continued to work alongside his former colleagues every day. He could have easily returned to his comfortable office with its beautiful view and air conditioning. Instead, he chose to stay on the construction site, working with his hands, sharing simple meals and proving through his actions that he truly cared about these people. The change didn't happen overnight. For many weeks, Tom, Lucy, and David barely spoke to James. They watched him carefully, waiting to see if this was just another trick. But slowly, very slowly, they began to see that James's actions matched his words. Tom was the first to forgive him when Tom's daughter became very sick and needed expensive medicine. James quietly helped pay for her medical treatment. He didn't make a big announcement about it or ask for thanks. Tom only found out when the doctor told him that someone had already paid the bill. Lucy began to warm up to James when he recommended her for a supervisor position. For the first time in her 8 years of construction work, she was given the respect and responsibility she had always deserved. James had fought hard with the management to make this happen. David finally smiled at James again when James made him the head of the new worker training program. The old man's years of experience and knowledge were finally being recognized. He would teach new workers the proper way to build things that would last forever. 6 months later, James stood with his friends looking at a completed apartment building. It was strong, beautiful, and built to last the families who would live. They would have safe, comfortable homes because of the work they had done together. Tom put his hand on James's shoulder and said something that surprised everyone. "You know, James, I'm glad you lied to us that first day." "Why?" James asked, genuinely confused. "Because if you had told us who you really were from the beginning, we would have treated you differently. We wouldn't have been real. With you, we would have been polite and careful, but not honest. And you wouldn't have learned what you needed to learn about us and about yourself." James looked at the building they had constructed together, then at the faces of his friends. He realized that the most important thing he had built wasn't made of brick and stone, but of trust, friendship, and understanding. He had learned that real leadership meant working beside people, not just giving orders from above.